And we're live. Welcome to episode 32 of Engaging the Eagle, exploring US foreign policy in Southeast Asia. I'm Kevin.
I'm Colin.
And we'll be your host for this episode, titled Another Look at Trump's Indo-Pacific Strategy. As compared to his first term, US President Donald Trump's approach to the Indo-Pacific appears to be undergoing a significant transformation. He has disrupted relationships with allies and partners with his tariff regime, while there are open questions about his commitment to groupings such as the Quad and AUKUS. Where will his strategy towards the region go from here, and what implications will this have for Singapore and the other countries in this region? To discuss this topic, we've invited Professor Derek Grossman, Professor of the Practice of Political Science and International Relations, University of Southern California, and Adjunct Senior Fellow with the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security, to come on our show. Thank you for joining us today, Professor.
Thanks for having me.
For the benefit of our audience, let's go back in time a little bit. When we talk about Trump's Indo-Pacific strategy, what did this entail during his first term? What has changed between the approach he used back then and right now?
Well, during his first term, Trump's administration was focused like a laser on countering China. They never used the word containing China, but much of what they did was tantamount to containing China as well. Mm-hmm. Fast forward to the second administration, and we see, I think, a very different approach. The approach that we're seeing today is much more premised on having a great power détente with China, a reset with China. We are sitting here just before Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping are going to meet in South Korea at the end of October. Trump has said on multiple occasions that he's looking forward to discussing reciprocal tariffs, additional issues related to the trade relationship, and potentially a TikTok deal that could be signed and, maybe some other things, right? And so the reason why there's such a difference is because during Trump's first administration, most of the people that he picked to be in his cabinet were selected from a list that was given to him by others because that was his first time serving in government. And so he did not have a ready-made list of people who could immediately fill some of these roles and do so competently. And so a lot of the people who came about in Trump's first administration were already known quantities from previous walks of life in the Republican orbit. And so they worked together to craft the Indo-Pacific strategy. They were mostly hawkish in nature, right? So everything was about countering China. Mm-hmm. In this administration, the president is picking people who are more of the loyalist variety. And that's because he has his own views of China and of foreign policy. And he feels in his first administration, he was kind of constrained, hemmed in by those around him who were stage managing his activities, right? Not allowing him to kind of be himself. So now with the loyalists in power, he's able to direct them more readily. And what I believe his foreign policy vision is one of great power, détente, and spheres of influence, right? So the United States essentially has the predominance of power, not just worldwide, but specifically within the Western Hemisphere. China has more power in the East Asia theater. Russia has more power in the Central Asia and perhaps Eastern Europe theater, and then India and South Asia and so forth, right? And as long as everybody stays to their respective centers of the earth, corners of the earth, then all will be fine. But the problem with that is globalization and the interconnectivity of our societies in a global societal sense makes that basically impossible to accomplish, right? But we are now seeing Trump pushing forward this notion, and I think we're going to see the national defense strategy, I guess now called the national war strategy, come out pretty soon, and it's going to highlight this exact approach, which is the U.S. is prioritizing its own hemisphere over other parts of the world, and great power competition is more akin to when China and Russia intervene in the Western Hemisphere and disturb the U.S.'s own neighborhood. That is how Trump wants to view competition, rather than the U.S. doing more abroad in other spheres of influence run by other great powers. To put this very simply, less is more.
I see.
And the onus will be on allies and partners like Singapore, to do more in the future. And I think that's going to result in a massive shift in the approaches that these allies and partners have to take going forward.
So like a concert of Europe, but for the modern age then.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the concerns I have about this is that when you look at the run-up to World War I and the interwar period and the run-up to World War II, right, you very much had a situation in which there were warring great powers, warring empires, essentially, right, especially in the run-up to World War I, right, where you had colonial and imperialist powers who could not find a way to remain in their respective corners of the earth. That was a heavy contributor to the friction that then resulted in World War.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the rules-based international order isn't perfect, but it has helped to a certain extent keep the peace for a very long time. And now, like you said during your talk, we're seeing the disintegration of that order and things are starting to get pretty dangerous.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. So the 80th anniversary of, the end of World War II, it was this year, and I actually just got back from attending Beijing's 12th annual Shangshan Forum. The Chinese were celebrating their victory over the Japanese, right, over authoritarianism, in doing so with the Russians and with the North Koreans, right, and others who attended, right? So everybody's got a view of history, and it's very much colored by their own interpretation of what transpired and what level of effort they put forward to create this rules-based international order or rules-based liberal international order, whatever you want to call it. But I think what is undeniable at this point is that even though the United States, along with the British and the Soviets, crafted this rules-based order in the aftermath of World War II, that international order is rapidly devolving, is rapidly deteriorating. And when you see the likes of Xi, Putin, and Kim standing side by side in Beijing, from an American perspective, that's a sign of a new world order that's starting to develop. That's going to be run by authoritarians for authoritarians, right? It is a fundamental breakdown in the rule of law, replaced by rule by law. And I have to say, even though maybe the average American is looking at those scenes in that manner, I'm not quite sure President Trump himself is or cares about it. In fact, when he sees Xi, Putin, and Kim standing next to each other, he wonders why he's not included in that group, rather than, why are you trying to destroy the United States and the rules-based order? I don't think he ever believed in a rules-based order. I mean, all you got to do is look at his views on the United Nations. He thinks the United Nations and the United Nations Charter, as part of it, should not exist, right? There should not be a forum for countries to hash out their differences in a peaceful way that maintains, peace and stability throughout the world. And so that, I think, is also very concerning.
If I could, Derek, thanks so much. I just want to build on your earlier observation, and perhaps, given that you always mention that you want to sort of put on the thinking hat of the country that you're analyzing, so maybe let's do it something a little differently. Instead of looking at it from the ally and partner perspective, let's perhaps put on the hats of the adversaries, right? China, Russia, North Korea, probably even Iran, for example. And assuming that Trump has communicated this intent, or at least signaled clearly the intent that, this is what he wants as a so-called New World Order. But do you think if you are sitting from Pyongyang or Beijing or Tehran or even Moscow, for example, do you think that this is not going to be structural? Meaning that, this is probably just Trump, and say the next round, if it's a new president, it will be another different thing. So why should I put my lot into this? So should I just simply go along with what I think to be my best interest, and I don't care about what the US is doing, I don't care about what Trump is doing. So what do you think?
Yeah, it's hard to get into the mind of any human being, much less an authoritarian, who tends to be very opaque in providing their true beliefs and views on things. But I think you're on to something, Colin, that typically authoritarians look at democracy as being a weak system, and that they ultimately are going to outlast that system. We can go back to Biden's time in office. He had many, many conversations with Xi, and he related to the American people that Xi is betting against democracy, that an authoritarian system, top-down system, is much more organized, much more focused, is able to leverage resources in a more efficient manner, right? And so I tend to think that, yes, Putin, Xi, Kim are just going to wait Trump out to see what happens next because they have the liberty to do so. They have the patience to do so. Also, I mean, I think there's the trust factor. I mean, what is it that Trump really wants out of their countries, right, when the U.S. has been so antagonistic in the past? Now, let's also tell the full story. They've also been antagonistic toward the United States. The street goes both ways, right? But from their perspective, the U.S. has not put down its weapons in any way. In fact, is building up its military with an over $1 trillion budget to continue to deter, And so why should these three countries in particular, plus Iran, if you will, why should they believe in any sort of reassurance from Trump or the United States? I mean, that doesn't seem to make sense. Also, I've heard different authoritarian leaders comment that they don't really fundamentally understand democracy and how it brings new leaders into play every few years who may have different views of the past policies. That's inconsistent and results in a less stable policy. It's less predictable, and it could cause greater tensions because of the shift in government and policy, right? So I tend to think that China, North Korea, Russia, Irans of the world are really looking for something that they can hang their hats on to say, this is what the U.S. policy is going to be going forward. But you can't really do that, especially right now, with so many changes from Trump to Biden back to Trump again.
So, Professor, I'd like to switch the conversation a little bit towards U.S. allies and partners, particularly, the grouping called the Quad. So, during his first term, the Trump administration used the Quad as a tool to try and counter China. What were the guiding principles behind reviving the Quad at that time?
Yeah, so the Quad, as you said, was resurrected in 2017, and it was clear that all four countries involved, Australia, Japan, India, and the U.S., were like-minded democracies seeking to counter China, even if they didn't explicitly say so in their statements. And nobody really knows the answer to this, but I think it was the byproduct of Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe having a very close relationship with Trump. Of course, Trump's highly personalistic. They golfed together many times. He got to know Abe and his wife, who he still keeps in touch with since Shinzo Abe's very tragic assassination. He became very, very comfortable with Abe. He listened to Abe. And Abe, let's remember, also was the same person who said we cannot allow the South China Sea to become, quote unquote, Lake Beijing. We need to have an Asian security diamond of the same countries I just mentioned to also make up the Quad, right? Coincidence? Probably not. And they need to work together, to prevent that outcome. Now, that was very much in line with the first Trump administration's policies and strategies, because like I said earlier, they were focused like a laser on countering China. This administration, I think, is very different because clearly Trump wants this reset with China, right? So the Quad may get in the way of that. It may cause more trouble than it's worth, especially if there's a Quad meeting right before he meets with Xi, because New Delhi is supposed to host it. The actual timing is still to be determined. It seems unlikely that it would happen before Trump meets with Xi. Probably makes more sense to do it after, but the timing will matter, is what I'm trying to say, because Trump does not want to spoil that meeting with Xi. I think Trump views the Quad and any other mechanisms to try to counter or contain China as potential leverage in this broader negotiation, right? So maybe from that perspective, you could say having a Quad meeting before he meets with Xi could be a good thing, but what if Xi walks away from the meeting because he met with the Quad? See, that's too high of a risk, I think, for Trump to take. So my view on it is that the Quad, I think, is going to stick around, at least for the time being, as these negotiations continue to happen. But ultimately, Trump is anti-globalist. He believes that the U.S. should be doing less. and that allies and partners should be doing more. Normally, if, say, Australia, Japan, and India all met up without the United States would be kind of upset. I don't think Trump actually cares about that. I think he would say, that's great that they're doing more. That means we have to do less. I also wrote a piece recently for Nikkei Asia a couple of weeks ago talking about this is how the Quad dies, ... again. Because the first time the Quad died in early 2008, it was a direct result of all 4 participants having political transitions and or getting cold feet about countering China. This time around, if the Quad does die again, I think it will be the direct result of the U.S. undermining the bilateral relationships that comprise the Quad. Whether it's the U.S. and Japan, U.S. and India, or U.S. and Australia, those relationships are all under enormous strain. And I can go into the details if you wish on each of those partnerships. But suffice it to say that you need all of those parts to create the whole. And so why would the Quad want to meet as a Quad when their relationship with the most central player of the Quad, the United States, is in bad shape?
But at the same time, I'd like to ask more about US-India ties. It's suffice to say they've been going through a rough patch recently, following that alleged disagreement over India buying Russian oil, financing Russia's war in Ukraine. But of course, that's not the only reason that's come up between the rough patch. Even so, considering all that, do you think the relationship can be salvaged?
I absolutely think it can be salvaged, but we do need to consider how long this is going to take. If you think that the US-India relationship, or any international relationship for that matter, is like a light switch that you could just turn on and off at will, that's usually not the case, right? And I think it's especially true in India's case. My understanding is the average Indian is not just angered, but they are literally outraged at what they see or what they've seen from the United States over the last few months. Whether it's Trump putting punitive tariffs on India for importing discounted barrels of Russian oil at 25%, or the initial reciprocal tariffs of 25%, or President Trump saying, I brokered the ceasefire between India and Pakistan, and India strongly disagreeing with that and saying, no, it was Pakistan who surrendered. Or, Trump hosting Pakistani Field Marshal Asim Munir at the White House for a closed-door lunch that went over 2 hours with no press conference, no readout of what happened, right? The Indians believe it was Asim Munir personally who orchestrated the terrorist attack at Pahalgam on April 22nd, which is what precipitated the 4-day war that India and Pakistan had in the month of May, right? So all of those things kind of add up to the Indians being extremely upset with the United States and, most importantly, having lost trust in the United States. Trust is something that has to be built over time, right? And so what I worry about is how long will this take? And if it does come back, and I think it can come back, but will it come back in a year, 2 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years from now? Will we already be into the next generation before we can repair the damage that has already been done? And by that point, where will we be in leveraging India as part of the Indo-Pacific strategy to counter China and working on all the other things that we can do very well together? I mean, we're going to miss out on some of those things if we're not careful.
That's definitely true. And the question that I've asked some of our previous guests as well is, can you even have an Indo-Pacific strategy if you're missing the Indo part of the equation? I think you mentioned this during your talk too. It implies that Trump doesn't really see the region as the Indo-Pacific. He kind of sees it like the way that presidents before him did, as the Asia-Pacific. It sounds like a broader term, but it kind of carves out that South Asia bit.
Yeah, I think the symbolism should not be lost on China here, because when the first Trump administration in 2017 renamed Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific, it was clear that we were bringing India and the Indian Ocean into play, that we were widening the field of competition against China. China wants to focus on Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, Korea scenario, right? That's all on the eastern flank of China. On the western flank, they want it to be peaceful and stable so that they can focus on the east. But now if the U.S., from a Chinese perspective, is meddling in the west, then they're going to have to do something about it. And that is going to distract and divide up their time and resources, right? That's what the Indo-Pacific strategy was all about, okay? Fast forward again to today, we're now seeing the term Asia-Pacific crop up more and more often, which leads some folks to believe maybe we're not thinking Indo-Pacific conceptually anymore. I'm not convinced of that. I think it's related to Trump meeting with Xi pretty soon, right?
Mm-hmm.
I just got back again from the Shangshan Forum in Beijing. They don't use Indo-Pacific. Everything was Asia-Pacific. So the fact that the Secretary of Defense, in his conversation with Admiral Dong Jing of the PLA Navy, used the term Asia-Pacific in the readout, that was very significant to show we're not backing down, we're not surrendering, but we are softening our language and aligning it actually with your language so that we can have a better relationship going forward and hopefully a better summit. I've been told on pretty good authority, Indo-Pacific is not going away. This is just more of a rhetorical point that is going to be used maybe just for the next couple of months.
Yeah, a lot of things seem to hinge on whether that meeting can occur and then what happens during that meeting as well. Colin, do you have any follow-up questions?
Actually, it's building on yours when it comes to the issue about the Indo-Pacific, because if you are wearing the thinking hat of India, right, and if you assume that the US under the current Trump administration isn't going to be reliable, what will be your calculations going forward? Is it going to be structural in the sense that India is somewhat being cast out of the calculation because of the current wording? Or if there is the correct signaling from Washington that, it's still Indo-Pacific, right? But going forward, if you are India, how would you hedge your calculations? Will it be, trying to improve ties with US? Or are there alternatives that you can explore beyond China? Because we know that there are still some structural issues between India and China that couldn't be wished away just simply by some handshakes between Modi and Xi, right? So what will be your next bet?
Yeah, so of course, before the 80th anniversary celebrations for Victory Day to end World War II in Beijing, we had the SCO Summit, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Tianjin in China. And the big question leading up to that was, will Modi go or will he not go? And he decided to go, which I think, you want to talk about symbolism, right? Modi was symbolically saying, I have other options. It's not just the United States. And some of the video, the photos that were taken, looked pretty chummy, didn't it? Right? Modi hanging out with Putin. But all eyes were on Xi and Modi, and it actually looked pretty friendly too. I think intentionally for both of them, right? China could say, look, we're stealing India from you, United States, right? Even though everybody who knows India knows that that's ridiculous because India is non-aligned or multi-aligned, another way to look at it, right? It's never going to put its lot in entirely with one country over another. Okay. And for Modi, it was also signaling that I will do things that I wouldn't normally do because Trump and the United States aren't treating me and India correctly, right? So that was the first time in 7 years that he went to China and had that meeting with Xi. So yeah, there's something to it, but I wouldn't read, I guess, too much into it because every Indian that I've ever talked to has said that the U.S. far and away is India's preferred strategic partner. You just have to look at the facts, right? There's still a lot of distrust between India and China. Yes, they have resolved their land border issue as of October of last year, but I would argue they've resolved it for now. It's not over, right? They were just able to draw back to positions status quo ante before the limited war in 2020. Also, they're very concerned about becoming economically dependent on China. They already are, right? And they want to have a diversified set of economic outlets. And the United States is the world's largest market, maybe overtaken by China in the future, but for now, it provides a pretty hefty counterweight to China, right? You look at India's relationship with Russia. Modi's very uncomfortable with what Russia's doing in Ukraine right now. But also there's a huge opportunity, which is to get that discounted oil, right? And at the end of the day, and I've said this many times, India is very realpolitik about this. It's ultra realist in the sense that it's completely taking morals, principles, and ethics out of the equation and only doing what it needs to do for its own people. It's almost like an India first way of thinking. And I think that It'll work for now, unless or until the Russia-Ukraine conflict heats up to the point that they have to get off the fence and actually do more. And I think that's what Trump was trying to say, except it was full of contradiction, because how are you going to let China off the hook importing Russian oil, right? Or how are you going to let some of the European countries off the hook? And then you're going to point the finger at India. So it actually engendered more distrust than it was worth. And then also consider that India's military is still majority Soviet and Russian build. And of course, Colin, you know a lot more about this than I do, but that majority build has actually been going down in percentage over time quite significantly. It's not majority American, but American military equipment is starting to become more prevalent, right? And especially as Russia invades Ukraine, Russia can pay less attention on arms sales to India and, most immediately and importantly, maintenance on the systems that India already has. Okay, so India is in a tough spot when it comes to preserving and kind of enhancing its military prowess if it's going to be so dependent on Russia. So I think, you know, those are some important factors that are really driving India into America's arms in spite of the images we saw over the last few weeks.
I see. Yes, that's definitely something we're going to have to watch going forward. But to turn the conversation a little bit further south, or southeast from India, I'd like to ask about Australia and AUKUS. What do you think are the prospects for AUKUS, especially amid a Trump administration review of the security framework? What's the likelihood of it being terminated or scaled back?
Yeah, so everybody is waiting with bated breath to get the review. We were told it would only take a month and it would have been done by now, but it's been delayed. And it's going to be at some point before the end of this year that the results will be released by the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Elbridge or Bridge Colby. My sense of it is that Bridge Colby, he wrote an entire book about countering China. He understands, I mean, he is a realist in international relations theory. And when it comes to international relations theory, he is a realist. And he believes that power differentials matter and that having Australia by your side in a potential conflict with China over Taiwan or in the South China Sea is going to be helpful. And also having the British by your side in the AUKUS pact is going to be helpful. And to the extent that there's an AUKUS pillar 2 to involve Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand, you know, maybe Singapore in the future, right? All of that could help. However, there's always a however. AUKUS is also a Biden-era deal. And anything that is Biden is now bad. So the politics are going to drive this review more than anything, I think. And that worries me. I would not rule out a complete cancellation of AUKUS. But my sense of it is, because Colby still understands the balance of power issues, that he will say yes to AUKUS. The review will come up as generally good, that we need AUKUS, but I think that there will be some sections that they'll have to scale back. And they'll be able to later say, we're doing some serious cost cutting.
Yeah.
In the spirit of Doge, right? In the spirit of being more accountable to the American people and taxpayer dollars.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, it's not entirely wrong. I mean, you should always review stuff to make sure you're staying on target with what you're doing, right? Even, I will say this, I didn't mention it in the talk, even the chief Pentagon implementer of AUKUS during the Biden time, his name is Abraham Denmark, he has gone on the record recently and said that he welcomes a review of AUKUS. That was his program, AUKUS, but he's now welcoming a cross-party review of AUKUS. And he said, because of exactly what I just said, you need to ensure that everybody is staying within budget and doing what AUKUS was originally intended to do.
I like how you explain that. You know, on the surface, there's nothing necessarily objectionable about prioritizing needs, cutting wasteful expenses when it comes to US defense expenditure and foreign policy, especially. But like you mentioned, what matters here is the reasons behind those cuts and how those are being played out. I think one of the things that we're going to be looking out for, not just the AUKUS review that's coming up, but also the upcoming National Defense Strategy or the National War Strategy, depending on what they call it, which is supposedly outlining an approach that prioritizes protecting the American homeland and Western Hemisphere over the Indo-Pacific. It's still a draft. We haven't seen the final product. But what do you make of this news? And what do you think it'll mean for Trump's, let's call it an approach to the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, so again, like you said, we don't know what's actually in the text. It'll probably come out in the next couple of weeks. But what it sounds like is a prioritization of the Western Hemisphere, as I was talking about earlier, and great power competition insofar as China and Russia are intervening within the U.S.'s neighborhood. That means anything that Russia is doing in its own sphere of influence, or that China is doing in its own sphere of influence, the U.S. will be far more selective in how or whether it responds. So let's just put some meat on the bones, right? When it comes to Ukraine, Trump obviously does not want to deal with Ukraine. He's facing enormous pressure from within his own party, from people like Senator Lindsey Graham, to do more on Ukraine, right? If it were up to Trump, Ukraine wouldn't be an issue, and the U.S. and Russia could just have a good great power to great power relationship. Putin and Trump could just be strong men ruling the world together, and there wouldn't be any concerns. Okay, that's how he envisions it. But that is not the reality. Same thing when it comes to Taiwan and U.S.-China relations, right? Taiwan is kind of this inconvenient issue from Trump's perspective that is preventing a better relationship with China. All right. And if only it would go away. And see, that's the concern I have in this broader reset with China, these negotiations. What might Trump throw out on the table to try to get that reset he's been looking for? Could it be, we will oppose Taiwan independence and we will not defend Taiwan in a military conflict? Well, I mean, that's a horrendous thing to throw on the table, right? I hope that never comes to pass. But it's not an impossibility, given how Trump has sort of been reacting to what's going on with Taiwan. And if it does happen, what are we getting in return for something like that? It's got to be something extraordinarily significant, which I believe China would be unwilling to do because they already think Taiwan is part of China. You just have the American president restating what China already believes. It's an accomplishment, but it's not really enough because China still does not have sovereignty over Taiwan, right? So there's still that issue at play. I worry about kind of this, great power détente idea, the sphere of influence idea, right? Because it's very much hearkening back to the 19th century and to the first half of the 20th century. Without a rules-based international order, this is what you get. You get nations that try to become more powerful, right? There are no guardrails. Well, there's never really guardrails, right? But at least you have something in place where they could negotiate. And there are rules that you can hold their feet to the fire on. But in this case, everyone's breaking the rules, to include, by the way, the United States. So that now leads to a much more chaotic, anarchical situation that I think has proven to be disastrous in the past.
I mean, I would just want to comment about how Taiwan could become a transactional issue because the Taiwanese have been quite concerned about what happened to Ukraine under the current Trump administration could happen to them. And it seems like it's playing out. I think you have seen the Washington Post report that the supposed military aid to Taiwan was sort of called off. And I guess what Trump is looking for is for Taiwan to buy US weapons, which I believe Taiwan is probably willing to do that in a way to try to sort of harness the relationship with Trump. But going forward, it does appear that it's going to be a dream or nightmare, you call that comes true for Taiwan. And do you think this is going to have some impact on the way, probably not Indo-Pacific writ large, but, say Western Pacific countries, especially those close to Taiwan? Do you think it will force them to make any recalculation pertaining to how they view US commitment to Taiwan and how they should align their own interests accordingly?
In a perfect world, they wouldn't have to make such tough decisions, but now they have to. And they already are, I think. In the case of Japan, the upper house elections and the Japanese First Party, making, limited gains. But the fact that it made any gain is a bad sign, right, for things to just sort of go back to status quo. The status quo is done. Now Japan is going to have to start thinking more and doing more for itself. I think South Korea maybe would not have been in quite the awkward position as Japan, although after ICE rounded up 300 some odd South Korean illegal workers from the Trump administration's perspective, we don't know if that's been borne out yet, right? And had them sent back to South Korea in shackles. And now there's going to be a South Korean government investigation of what happened, and not only whether illegal actions occurred, but human rights violations may have occurred, right? This is a national humiliation for South Korea. This is something that really kind of plays into their history of Japanese colonialism and the comfort women issue and things like that, being mistreated at the hands of external powers. I mean, this is like the third rail in South Korea, right? And so I think whether President Lee wants to or not, I mean, I think he's pretty pragmatic and would like to keep the alliance the way it is and expand upon it. That may not be possible after what we've seen in the last couple of weeks. It may not. Again, not in as precarious of a position as Japan is because of their extreme dependence on the United States for their security. But I think South Korea is still going to face a lot of political pressure domestically to trust the U.S. a lot less and to do less with the U.S. going forward.
I see. Thank you. So, Professor, as we wrap up, are there any last thoughts that you'd like to leave the audience with? Hopefully something positive, maybe?
Well, I do think that in the end, would it be best for the U.S. and China and the U.S. and Russia to have a better relationship? Absolutely. But the devil is always in the details. What are the terms of this new relationship? And if we are sacrificing our longstanding principles, we are bending or breaking the rules-based order, we are essentially selling out our allies and partners, then that is something that I cannot sign up for. But I am somebody who is quite pragmatic, and I believe that there is always room for compromise. And if it can avert spiraling great power competition and that could lead, God forbid, to a World War III scenario, then we have to continue the conversation. So in that aspect, I do hope and pray for President Trump and for the United States to have a better relationship with these countries and for those countries to also reciprocate, because without that, we're all at risk, unfortunately, because we have to live on this earth together.
You're not alone in that hope. Thank you for your time, Professor. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If there are any questions or topics that you'd like us to tackle in future episodes, feel free to reach out to us on social media or through email. Until next time, stay safe, and we'll see you again.